If you were a even slightly hip young couple in the 70s, 80s and possibly 90s, you may have shyly ordered a book which was published in 1972 and sort of changed the world. You wouldn't have been alone. Over 12 million copies of that book have been sold in the years since. And if you grew up in those decades, maybe your parents had a copy on their shelves alongside perhaps Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Catch-22 and The Fear of Flying. Well, that may have made you cringe rather, or perhaps it surreptitiously piqued your fascination and you sneaked to look at it when you could. Alongside the text, that book and its sequel contained some rather pretty pencil drawings and a few paintings of a slightly hippie-looking couple. There was a lot of hair, put it that way. I'm talking, of course, about The Joy of Sex, a book whose title was a riff on a previously best-selling book, The Joy of Cooking, and it was organised into sections a bit like a cookbook with starters, main courses, sauces and pickles, and problems. The Joy of Sex spent 11 weeks on the top of the New York Times bestseller list. And for years, it was rarely out of those lists. And it generated various sequels, revised editions, and a lot of imitators. So you might be thinking, this is not really an artifact of lost culture, Stephen. What's it doing on the shelves of the Bureau? Well, there's two reasons. Firstly, the person that wrote it, Dr. Alex Comfort, was a deeply countercultural figure, as we will find out. And secondly, because The Joy of Sex kind of represents the moment when the sexual revolution of the countercultural years burst through into bourgeois bedrooms of the middle class mainstream. It changed a lot of people's lives. Well, their sex lives anyway. This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen. Welcome back. I'm glad you're here on this journey with me to try and uncover what this thing called counterculture means, to share these oral histories and testimonies from the other side. You can check out all that we do at bureauoflostculture.com and join my correspondence of recent weeks, Chris, Tony, Matthew, Ben, J.K. and Neil, just writing in with their thoughts and appreciation. Now, my guest today is social justice, journalist, activist, anarchist, writer, Eric Laursen. He writes for The Nation, Village Voice, and The Independent, Huffington Post, and he's the author of several books, including The Operating System, an anarchist theory of the modern state. We're going to talk a little bit about anarchism in this episode. His most recent work is a proper doorstopper, a huge book about a huge life, Polymath, The Life and Professions of Dr. Alex Comfort, author of The Joy of Sex. It's the first biography of one of the most remarkable and wide-ranging intellectuals of the second half of the 20th century. Eric's joined me to talk about Alex Comfort's extraordinary life and about that book that has changed the bedroom. Hi, Eric.
Hi, thanks for having me, Stephen.
Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture. As I said there in the intro, The Joy of Sex is really hardly a artifact of lost culture, given the enormous sales it has enjoyed, but its author, Alex Comfort, was a deeply countercultural person, and The Joy of Sex, in some ways, was the counterculture going mainstream. Is that anywhere near the truth?
That's not a bad way to put it, actually. I think just given what Alex's career spanned, he was in a way not only a participant but a predecessor of the counterculture. Right. And certainly The Joy of Sex was the kind of a book that really could not have materialized or been as successful as it was at any other time than, more or less the heyday of the 60s, 70s counterculture. So absolutely, you're spot on with that.
Well, we're going to talk about your book, Polymath, The Life and Professions of Dr. Alex Comfort. Polymath being the right word in this case. I mean, a poet, novelist, biologist, gerontologist, cultural critic, broadcaster, activist, and an anarchist. And that brings me somehow to you, Eric, because I thought it'd be good to hear a little bit about you. My first question to you, actually, is, are you an anarchist?
I am, yes, of many years standing.
What does that mean?
I mean, on the basic level, it means that I'm opposed to the state and capitalism. And I hope that my activism and my writing and so forth encourage people to look at alternatives to the state and to capitalism and to criticize those institutions on a very, very fundamental level. So that's more or less the long and the short of it. An anarchist is someone who believes that a society can be created on the basis of mutual aid, not only that can, but it must be at a time like this when the state capitalist system we have is working so badly in terms of our human needs.
It seems pretty countercultural to me in these times to be an anarchist, and particularly we get the impression that in the States just the word socialist is like a swear word, an insult, something to be terrified of, whereas of course obviously there's people here who try and push that agenda too, but most of the European countries regard themselves as generally sort of socialist. So how is it being an anarchist in America in these strange times?
Especially during presidential season, it's not great because the politics tends to veer very much in a law and order direction, and anarchists are caricatured as being people who are mainly interested in throwing large spherical bombs at post offices or places like that, which is something that anarchists haven't done for a very, very long time. People in America love to think of themselves as middle class, and they love to think of themselves as being protected by the institutions, by the police and the military and so forth. And so the very idea of the word anarchist is something that really sets people off a lot of the time. But it's complicated because people in this country also like to think of themselves as rugged individualists
Right.
who question authority and so forth on some level. And so it's very common to find politicians over here who really are very authoritarian, like to sort of preen themselves on being people who question the state or prefer a small state and so forth. So there's a great deal of hypocrisy around it too. So as you can see, it's complicated over here.
Sure. Well, listen, I'm guessing then in that case that one of the things which attracted Alex Comfort to you as a subject to write the biography that you've written was the fact that he was an anarchist, amongst many other things. But tell us how you first came across him and why spend imagining quite a lot of your time and energy writing this huge book.
I mean, I first encountered Alex Comfort the way a lot of people encountered him for the first time, which was in the early 70s. I was, in my early teens, and I ran across big piles of the book in bookstores near me. And so I, sneak a peek at it, being 13, 14 years old, and every time it seems I looked at the bestseller list in the weekend newspaper, there it was at the top of the list. It just went on and on. And after a while, it was joined by a book called More Joy, which was the sequel. Later on, I was at university, and I remember picking up a reference book called Contemporary Poets, running across his name and thinking, wait a second, is this the same person who wrote Joy of Sex? Well, isn't that interesting? Then later still, I was writing a book about the attacks on the Social Security system here. And since that's more or less our old age pension system in the United States, I had to learn a little bit about gerontology and life expectancy and so forth. And I again ran into him as being a major figure in the study of human aging. A few years further on, I was recommended to read a book by him called Authority and Delinquency in the Modern State, which was about how the state produces authoritarian personalities and even sort of cultivates them and enables or allows them to do unspeakable things like genocide. And I thought it was a really bold, interesting thesis. And so I started to think, well, gee, hasn't somebody ever written something about this person? And I found there was, the only book I could find was a very short study of his poetry and fiction from the early 70s. And I thought, well, wait a second, this is ridiculous. And so I started poking around. I found that he'd written over 50 books. in all kinds of different fields. And I thought, why not try and do this book myself?
Well, congratulations. It's an epic work. And I mean, like, as we said earlier, it's an epic life, isn't it? Let's dive into The Joy of Sex for a bit, because, of course, for most people, that's all they know about him. Or if they remember his name, they'll think about it mainly in terms of that book. And even though he, I think, rather sort of disingenuously sort of tried to claim that it was just accident that The Joy of Sex happened to be the most successful of his 50 books. In the book, you talk about the fact that people found him quite exhausting. And
they could, yeah.
The question I'm sure you've been asked many times is that how did he have time to have sex? He was doing so many things.
That's a good question. He's one of these people who just had an inexplicable amount of energy. And he was very good at multitasking. He was very good at switching gears. As a matter of fact, that's the one question that I have difficulty answering. One thing I do know is that, he was a pretty prominent person in the British literary scene in the 40s and 50s, particularly. And unlike a lot of writers and poets in those days, he didn't do a lot of pub crawling. He was not one to go and have a pint regularly with his friends or colleagues. And he used to reprimand some of them and say, you shouldn't be doing this. You have a lot more work to do. Why are you hanging around in places like this? So he was always working on some level, and his mind was always working. So that's a partial answer.
The image on the cover of your book, Polymath, he looks rather stern. I mean, that's the second question. He doesn't look like a person who'd spend his nights, in indoor sport, as he called it. He looks like a sort of T.S. Eliot style, kind of slightly buttoned up, or almost like the headmaster of a kind of British public school. Later on, he did sort of grow his hair a bit and look a bit more hip, didn't he? But he had this background as a sort of BBC broadcaster and public intellectual. But the book comes out in 1972, sells over 12 million copies. As you said, it's at the top of the bestseller list sort of month after month, year after year. There's been lots of spin-offs and revised editions down the years. Why was it so successful?
It was the right book at the right time. You got to remember that in 1972, the sexual revolution wasn't a new thing. It had been around for a few years. And so it was time, I guess you could say, for it to be introduced to a middle-class audience, as opposed to just people who were more experimental in their lifestyles. There's some specifics about the book that are worth mentioning here. First of all, and the first and foremost, really, is the voice that Alex brought to it. There had been plenty of books about sex, including some bestsellers before that. They were either extremely dry and medical and overeager to appear serious and not pornographic. The other category were books you could buy through the mail in this country in a brown paper wrapper that were pornographic and were extremely cheesy and full of misinformation and full of just graphic stuff. Nobody had really figured out until Joy of Sex came along how to find a path between those two ditches and not fall into one. And what Alex did was he came up with a voice that was casual, that was humorous, that was sort of disarming and straightforward. Without trying hard to be sexy, without trying too hard to be serious. And that was really, in a way, the greatest innovation of the book, because if you look at almost any sex manual that's been produced since then, and there are tons of them, they all partake of that voice a little bit.
Right.
I mean, he really gave people permission to talk about sex in an unembarrassed, casual way. That was a major reason that the book was a success. He liked to say also that it gave people permission to indulge their fantasies. If you wanted to dress up as a nurse or an airline stewardess or a pirate or something and have sex that way, it was considered weird. He encouraged people to do this kind of thing, to use the bedroom as a place to indulge their fantasies. And giving permission he felt was a big part of what it made a success as well. The other fortunate thing is that he found the publisher there, James Mitchell, was kind of a visionary in terms of how to put together illustrated books. And they came up with a very good visual counterpart to what Alex's voice gave them. Drawings rather than photographs, which could look dirty or pornographic. The drawings and the paintings in the book are very tasteful, but also they're not of people who look like porn stars or
Right.
look like glamorous people. They're fairly ordinary. They're actually fairly middle-aged, the couple. The man looks sort of hippie-ish. The woman does not shave her armpits and so forth. They look like people who you could meet in any setting. So they removed the sort of mystique that would kind of distance you from the thing.
Right, and practically, I suppose, I mean, they wouldn't have got away with using photographs anyway in this country at that time. I'm sure lots of listeners are familiar with the book, possibly older listeners because they bought it back in the day, or younger ones because their parents had a copy, or they, like you, stumbled across it in a bookshop. But the drawings are quite pretty, aren't they? They're sort of definitely not threatening. And as you say, this kind of attractive but, could be ordinary hippie-ish couple. You mentioned that there'd been previous sex manuals, sex how to do it, sex advice books, right the way back. There's Mary Stopes' Married Love back in 1918, right? And that was a groundbreaking book, wasn't it, at the time? I mean, a very radical book. Masters and Johnson in the 60s, a little bit more scientific and medical, I guess, or psychological, wouldn't they? Human sexual response But they were bestsellers, weren't they? And then you mentioned, is it David Rubin's Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex, which is the heterosexual missionary is okay, but everything else is a bit weird.
Right.
And then this Nina and George O'Neill's Open Marriage and New Lifestyle for Couples. So there was this kind of, it was going on. But let's set it in terms of the sexual revolution, Eric. I mean, what do you understand by that phrase, by that kind of thing that happened in the countercultural years of the late 50s and 60s?
If you read any sort of standard book on the sexual revolution, it hits the high points of the Kinsey Report, Wilhelm Reich, Masters and Johnson, the hippie counterculture, these sort of headline names and events. But what I found, and this is something that Alex was very conscious of because he was a doctor, seeing couples in the 40s and early 50s who were having problems in bed and so forth, and counseling them or trying to find people who could counsel them. His writings about sex go all the way back to 1947, 48, actually, but he was aware of the sexual revolution was actually kind of a thing that was happening beneath the surface after the war. There were spikes in both the United States and in the UK in out-of-wedlock births. And a lot of this had to do with lifestyle. People were moving around more in those days. After the war, America particularly became a much more mobile society. People were moving out of their very contained neighborhoods into bigger cities like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, etc., finding themselves in places they were unfamiliar with, trying to make lives for themselves where the rules weren't as clear cut. And the same thing was happening in the UK to a large extent. The rise of the bed sitting room, for example, people were creating new kinds of ways to associate with each other, and sex outside of marriage and sex for recreation was something that was becoming much more of a part of the culture. And it was not just in places where Beat Generation or people like that gathered, but in more buttoned down parts of so let's say Wilhelm Reich or the Masters and Johnson, they were kind of manifestations of this deeper change that was happening. Alex realized that people needed information and weren't getting it. And this was something that the Kinsey Report had made clear very early on, and that what people said they did in behind closed doors was often very, very different from what they were actually doing. And so that's why there was a need for a book like this, because when everything you wanted to know, you always wanted to know about sex came out, it was a bestseller because people were hungry for this kind of thing. But Alex was absolutely appalled by it because it was full of just inaccuracies and distortions. And he felt that it was making people feel anxious, whereas the point was to make them feel less anxious. And that was one of the things that he used to say was a major reason for writing Joy of Sex, was to put people at their ease about it. be less self-conscious, have less of a feeling that they had to operate within certain boundaries if they wanted to have sex.
As you say, you've been writing about sex, you've been collecting card indexes, hasn't he, on the subject of sex back in the 40s.
Yes.
And, he had this hope that, and he had these
Right.
two rules, don't risk producing unwanted children and don't exploit other people's feelings.
Right.
And in terms of don't risk producing unwanted children, I suppose the other major thing in terms of the sexual revolution was in this country, was the pill, which made it possible to do that, right? It helped to liberate women. It brought with it a lot of other stuff which probably did involve exploiting people's feelings as well. It was the pill. The pill didn't solve that part of the equation, did it? But I was also thinking too, in terms of countercultural terms, I mean, here we had things like International Times and Oz magazine.
Yes.
The independent press, the free press as it were. They seemed also to have play quite an important role in this, because quite frequently they would feature images of naked people. They would have articles on sex, on being gay as well. I mean, they were ahead of the pack on that. So there was this kind of printed publishing context as well here, albeit in the independent sector, which then made it possible for a inspired visionary publisher to think, hold on a minute, this is the right time for this. If we do it right, we can combine Alex's knowledge and tone and get the right images, and maybe the British public is ready for it.
Well, that's an interesting point there, because actually the book came out right about the time that the Oz magazine prosecution was happening.
The obscenity trial, yeah.
Mary Whitehouse was starting her crusade against sex on TV and so forth. There's this whole idea that The Joy of Sex was a more middle-class version of the counterculture in a way. But I tried very hard in the book to put it in the context of the more radical stuff that was happening at the time. Not just with Oz, but there was Suck, the magazine that Germaine Greer was helping to put out, for example. And actually, when I talked to people who were involved at that time, they were doing much more radical things in their own way, but they actually all thought The Joy of Sex was a very good book. They were very glad to have something like that out. They thought, well, this is, all to the good.
Here is a sidebar drawn from The Joy of Sex. Rather than getting into too many details, which might be awkward for all of us, I thought I'd just give you a list of the contents of two of the sections. Under main courses, we have bidet, breasts, buttocks, cassoulet, croupade, cuissard, earlobes, equipment, feet, flanquette, food, frontal, hair, handwork, kisses, little death, lubrication, matrimonial, menstruation, missionary position, mons pubis, mouth music, navel, negress, postures, quickies, rear entry, scrotum, shower bath, skin, standing positions, tongue bath, upper hands, and exposition. Under the section Sauces and Pickles, we have anal intercourse, armpit, bathing, big toe, bites, blowing, bondage, boots, buttered bun, chains, chastity belt, Chinese style, clothed intercourse, corsets, dancing, discipline, exercises, feathers, femontal intercourse, feur de rose, Florentine, foursomes and moresomes, friction rub, G-string, gadgets and gimmicks, guanahish, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, goldfish, grope suit, harness, horse, horseback, ice, Indian style, inversion, Japanese style, jokes and follies, carezza, leather, masks, mirrors, motor cars, what? Motorcycle, really? Open air, patos d'araignée, my French isn't very good, I'm sorry, pompoir, pornography, postal fanage, railways, remote control, rocking chair, rubber, Saxonus, shoes, slow masturbation, South Slav style, stockings, substitutes, swings, Turkish style, vibrators, Viennese oyster, voyeurs, and wet look. So we went around the world there. Sorry about my pronunciation on a few of those things, but I'm sure there's enough there to, as it were, whet your appetite.
Mitchell Beasley decided very early on that the best course of action was to get the book published in the United States first, where it seemed that there was pressure. The Nixon administration was prosecuting pornography, but it seemed like the States would be more receptive. And the book actually didn't come out in the UK until 2 years after it was published in the States.
Ah, okay.
But even when it came out in the States, they arranged for it to be published by Crown Publishers, which also had a mail order arm. They didn't know for sure that bookstores would take it in the States. And they felt, well, if we can't sell it that way, we'll sell it through the old-fashioned way with, off-color items through the mail. Then lo and behold, bookstores did take it and displayed it prominently. And that was the other part of the revolution on a certain level is books like that had never been sold in mainstream bookstores before. And all of a sudden, you had a snowballing effect, and the book was very successful in the States. In the UK, the first time they tried to bring about 1,500 copies in just as to distribute to people to read, to write reviews of it, it was seized at the docks.
Right.
They had it, so it took 2 years before they actually felt like things had loosened up enough that they could put it out in the UK, and then it was very successful there.
Okay, so in actual fact, we weren't quite ready for it. Let's also just talk a little bit before we go back to hear more about Alex Comfort's countercultural life pre this. In terms of making the book, it came out of the context of his extramarital affair with one of his and his wife's friends, right, Jane Henderson. Because
Yes.
he'd been married, quite conventionally for 15 years, right, hadn't he? And then began this affair with Jane Henderson. His wife, Ruth, rather reluctantly, I got the impression, submits to the idea of having an open marriage, so he splits himself between weekends with her and weekdays with Jane. And obviously for him, there was a sort of sexual revolution with Jane, because that sort of set his personal context for doing this, including the first images that they sort of didn't use them in the end, but the first images that were proposed for the inspiration for the artists, right?
Right. Jane Henderson was a family friend. She was somebody who was part of their lives. They went on vacation with her sometimes. Round about 1960, this affair started. It was sort of, I guess, what you'd call a midlife crisis. Alex was turning 40. They began this, and after a period of time, Alex said to Ruth, I'd like to sort of regularize this. I want to spend half my time with her, half my time with you. Ruth went along with it, I think, because, frankly, she liked the life she had with him, and she didn't want it disrupted. You have an established life, and you want to hold on to it as much of it as you can. What was going on between Alex and Jane was different, though, is that Alex had been doing research on sex for quite a while, and this was his chance to act a lot of it out. So they tried different things in Jane's apartment. They took Polaroids. They eventually put together a notebook, which they called Our ABC by John and Jane Thomas, which essentially documented a lot of different positions and things you could do in bed. This was something that they would show to people every now and then. Ruth was officially his wife. She came to social occasions. She was the people his friends and colleagues knew. Jane was the person he had other friends with on other occasions, and when he went to travel to conferences and give talks and so forth abroad, which he often did, because he was a very famous person in scientific circles by this time, Jane went with him.
Right.
So, he really was dividing his life, but having this experience with her made him think about putting together some kind of a book like Joy of Sex. And there's hints in his writing about coming up with something like that by the early 60s, less than a couple of years after he and Jane had started their affair. And then the David Rubin book came along, and he suddenly decided this has to be done.
Right.
And he realized he had the makings of it already.
Have you seen the book that they made together, or any of the Polaroids?
I've seen reproductions of some of it. It's not as inspiring as it might sound.
I'm going to take my hat off to anybody who can operate a Polaroid camera while having sex.
Right.
I mean, you can't even get the image right when you're looking through viewfinder with those things, and then you've got to press a big button. I don't know how you do that.
No, it's fairly crude. And think about doing it in the early 60s when he showed the Polaroids to Mitchell Beasley and said, well, you can use these to create the drawings and so forth. tossed them out more or less out of hand.
They tried a few other things, didn't they? They tried to get models to pose, didn't work out so well. I think, didn't the publisher sort of search through Soho pawn shops looking for magazines that they could kind of use as the inspiration for the artist?
They tried a kind of a cut and paste technique. They take these magazines, cut them up and put them in different positions, but it was just hopeless. They actually had a couple who they hired from some kind of encounter parlor or something in Soho. It looked cold and sort of cheesy, and they abandoned that. And finally, the couple who they used was Charles Raymond, who was the person who actually did the paintings for the book. And he and his wife posed, while Chris Foss, who did the drawings, actually took the photos that they used as references. And that was another element, actually, in a way, of the success of the book, is because they look like they're having a genuine, lovemaking encounter, and they look affectionate. And that was another thing that helped to sort of make people feel relaxed and okay with the book, I think.
Did they share in the huge profits that the book made, or was it a kind of one-off fee?
It was a one-off fee that they took. Charles Raymond and Chris Foss worked again on More Joy of Sex. They probably did somewhat better on that one, at least according to Chris when I interviewed him. But nobody was really initially expecting the book to be anywhere as successful as it was. By the time the package was completed, they thought they had something very promising on their hands, but nobody really thought it was the kind of thing you were going to invest in.
And that it was going to explode into the mainstream culture in the way that it did, right?
Right.
What was the response then? By the critics, by the reviewers, and, obviously we know what the response was by the public because they were buying it in the millions. But, I mean, have you got a sense of the impact that it had? Was the impact revolutionary?
It was. The book jumped into mainstream life in a way that surprised a lot of people. And the reviews of it were actually very, very good right from the start, especially in the States. One reason for that is that more conservative critics and people who were part of what was known as the moral majority, and they were caught off guard by it. They didn't see it coming. And so they didn't jump in and start denouncing it until More Joy of Sex was published a couple of years later. By that time, the genie was out of the bottle, basically. And the interesting thing is that within a few years, by the late 70s, evangelical Christians were producing their own sex manuals. There were a number of them that were quite successful that essentially tried to have a line that, well, good sex is an important thing in good marriage, and we, of course, are in favor of successful marriages. And all of that came out of the Joy of Sex, too. That gives you an idea of how much of a revolution it was. People from that side of the line started taking up the idea of good sex as well. They wanted to keep it within the institution of marriage.
We'll never know, obviously, to quantify what effect it actually had on people's sex lives, but you can kind of deduce from that it was huge. So this is a majorly radical publication, right? More Joy of Sex, Lovemaking Companion comes out, it's 1977. To put it in the context of his bigger life and his bigger thinking, is that he always connected that the joy of sex between, consenting people was actually good for society, that it was part of social transformation. He said this thing that people who've eroticized their experience of themselves are inconveniently unwarlike. For me, it goes right the way back to the sort of 60s sexual revolution, when it was, that being naked, having sex openly was part of this movement towards peace and love, right? So he had that through it all. It wasn't just for him like, okay, I've got a great idea to produce a sex manual. And it comes out a bit more, doesn't it, in More Joy of Sex, that with this bigger theory that he had about sex and society.
That's absolutely right. And his ideas about that are something that he was starting to develop right back from the late 40s on. I would say that his thinking about this was fairly sophisticated. He didn't simply believe that if everybody had better sex, every war would stop, or this sort of thing. But the standard idea would be that sex has two purposes, pleasure and procreation, not necessarily in that order. But he added a third element to it because he felt that sex had a role in socializing people. It was one of the first things that people learned how to do usually in their teen years. And that was one thing, is that he didn't believe there was anything wrong with teenagers having sex. In fact, he felt that is the time when they should be learning what this thing is and how it works. And the principal thing to him was that sex is the first instance in your life where you really have to learn to relate one-on-one to another person. What are your desires? What are mine? What are my needs? How do we work together to fulfill them in a non-aggressive and peaceful way? And that this was critical to how people develop as social beings. So, he said later on that the joy of sex was an expression of his anarchism. And so you can kind of see it in this way of looking at sex. Alex was a pacifist. He was an opponent. He campaigned against civilian bombing during World War II. He was a very big, prominent member of the Ban the Bomb movement in the UK in the 50s and 60s. And he felt that warlike societies, or societies that were based on a competitive capitalist model where people were constantly in a kind of a state of precariousness as to how they're going to make a living, whether their homes are going to be bombed, what kind of state they're going to be in, had a rebound onto sex itself. How can you have a good sex life at home, or one that's cooperative and non-aggressive, when the rest of your life is just saturated with aggression and
Right.
saturated with violence in one way or another? If you had a society like that sex couldn't serve the role in promoting sociality that he felt it was supposed to serve. And so you get this sort of cycle going where sex is aggravating problems rather than helping to alleviate them. In other words, if you're going to have a revolution on a social level, you have to have a revolution in personal life as well. And that's where all of a sudden his thinking is starting to really mesh with the counterculture. And what he's writing, 10 or even 15 years before the counterculture is really recognizable as such, is contributing to that way of thinking. The personal is political and the political is personal, and they're all bound up together.
He said this thing as well about rulers, as in people who rule over us, the people in power. That he believes that they had this conviction that sexual freedom was in some way related to political liberty. That was one reason to resist it. I mean, he did say capitalism and the state had created this barbaric world that deformed people's ability to have good sex. I would add to that, having spent quite a bit of time studying the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s, that it wasn't just about capitalism. I mean, communists are the same. In the Soviet times, they definitely associated the libido and, particularly young people's sexual feelings with risk, political risk, that somehow actually, if people gave in to these wild passions, young people, rather than getting on with the important business of building a new world, that it was dangerous and had to be repressed. So it wasn't just the capitalists. He also saw politicians as psychopaths, didn't he? He described them as the only way that you could be a sort of successful politician, being prepared to drop bombs on people and do all other stuff, is that if you're a psychopath.
He felt that the political system combined with capitalism produces people for leadership roles and grooms them to some extent, people who are willing and able to do really violent, horrible things. On the one hand, I mean, you get a Hitler, obviously, but you also get perfectly sane, democratic people elected in a democratic manner who are willing to drop napalm on Indochinese villages. They don't do that in their personal lives, but they feel like the state more or less gives them permission to do this. And so he felt that there was literally a kind of a psychopathology of the state that we have to resist. He has this very interesting use of the word responsibility. That responsibility is one of the things we're taught to think of as this very buttoned down, you've got to go to work every day and make your money, and you have to raise a family, and you have to vote right, and so forth, and go to church, etc. Alex saw responsibility differently. He saw a responsibility to disobey when the state tells you to do things that are not acceptable. In the 50s, he argued that because the state regarded any kind of homosexual sex as criminals, that a psychiatrist could not, in good conscience, cooperate with the laws the state tried to enforce about homosexuality because those are barbaric and those are irrational. He tried to get people to think of responsibility as towards other human beings as
Right.
opposed to towards institutions.
I mean, he was way ahead of it there, wasn't he? Back in the late 40s, arguing that private homosexual acts between consenting adults were hurting nobody and should be decriminalised. I mean, the joy of sex, of course, it has to be said, it's the joy of heterosexual sex largely, isn't it? It's a heterosexual couple. He talks more about bisexual, and he kind of thought that homosexual people were really bisexual. So he was not sort of fully radical in that respect, but he was still way ahead in terms of gay liberation, and decriminalising gay sex.
Yeah, he was very, in the 50s, of course, was when the Wolfenden Commission was producing its report in the UK, and then the British Medical Association at the same time was producing a really appalling report on homosexuality that was very negative. And Alex wrote a scathing piece on the BMA report in The Lancet, just dissecting the kind of cultural attitudes that sometimes get baked into scientific and medical thinking. You're right. I mean, The Joy of Sex was very much a book of its time. There's a lot in it that's very sexist, that's very sort of phallocentric. Homosexuality is all right as far as he's concerned, but he tended to think of it as we're all on a continuum. Everybody is a little bit one and a little bit the other. Homosexuality is on one end of the spectrum and heterosexuality is on the other. And he discouraged people from thinking of themselves as either one or the other.
Right.
Which, if you think about it, the 70s was when gay liberation began. And not everybody thought that was extremely helpful at the time because the thrust was to get people to identify, as gay.
Fully as gay, right.
Right. While he certainly supported their rights, he tended to say, well, we want people in general to be much more free-form about this kind of stuff. His way of looking at it is maybe more popular now in a time when transsexuality and is much more of an accepted thing, or at least it's fighting to become a more accepted thing.
And also when a time when moving between different sexualities is seen as completely acceptable.
Exactly. Yeah. And I should say that the feminist movement did have some pretty harsh things to say about Joy of Sex in later years. Although initially a lot of people in the women's movement welcomed it simply because it was so much better than what was out there already.
Eric, I just wanted to fill in a few gaps before we sort of move on to post Joy of Sex. So This is just Alex as a youngster, so we talked about the fact that he was sort of manically productive and quite exhausting to be around, given the amount of things that he did. But that started right when he was back at school. He was at school here in London, grew up in Barnet, went to Highgate, publishing poems in school magazine, set up a peace society, gets interested in science, blows off 3.5 of his fingers on one hand while making fireworks. It was amusing to read that he later claimed that this crippled left hand was actually useful for performing uterine inversions, a medical procedure, right?
Yeah, he also was very adept at using it to tie flies when he went fishing.
Right. And it obviously didn't get in the way of him having joyful sex, presumably.
Not at all.
He developed this passion for mollusks. I don't know why that's funny, but it is somehow. And he qualifies as a doctor, right? And he's working in the London hospital here. And actually, he'd been a Christian for a while, hadn't he? I mean, he sort of, I think his experience or witnessing what was happening during World War II sort of blew his religious faith away. But this was a very interesting one for me, is that because of he's crippled with his hand, there's no way that he's going to be called up as a soldier. So he could have just, kept his head below the parapet. He's a pacifist already. Mm-hmm. But rather than just doing that, he actually insisted on registering as a conscientious objector with all that would bring upon him, right? That is somebody who's quite committed.
It was not a great time to be a pacifist. The 30s actually were kind of a heyday for pacifism in the UK. The Peace Pledge Union and so forth was a very big organization. Once the war started, and certainly when the Blitzkrieg started, that changed very, very rapidly. Alex was in a somewhat fortunate position, not just because of his damaged hand, but because he wouldn't have been called out from university anyway because he was training as a doctor.
Right.
Those people were regarded as too important for their training to be interrupted. What he did, he wrote pamphlets and articles for the Peace Pledge Union's publication, which did soldier on, so to speak, during the war, and for Freedom Press, the anarchist publisher, which was also committed to a pacifist line. And what that meant in practicality was that he campaigned against the bombing of civilian targets during the war. He got any number of famous people to sign on to it. And at one point, sort of famously, he and George Orwell published poems back and forth on the subject of pacifism in Guardian.
Orwell, for a while, described him as a pinky, didn't he? As a kind of almost like a commie coward.
Orwell said of Alex and a number of other pacifists that they are objectively pro-Nazi, which they, of course, weren't. As far as Orwell was concerned, the fight against fascism simply overrode everything else. For people like Alex, knew that he wasn't going to stop the war. What he knew, however, was that it was his duty to bear witness to what was going on and to make sure that people in the UK understood what it was they were participating in, sort of inhumanity and the obscenity of the whole thing. And of course, after the war, there was a fairly wide acknowledgement that the bombing of Hamburg, the bombing of Dresden, other cities like this was effectively a war crime. And the Geneva Conventions did include a number of years later prohibition against this. Not that it's been observed all that well, certainly not being observed right now in various parts of the Middle East.
But it was bold and committed of him, wasn't it, to do all that when, as a pacifist, he could have been quite quiet about it, given the fact that he wasn't going to actually be called up himself.
His sort of moral and ethical argument about this was very, very strong, and he took it all the way.
So much so that he was blacklisted for the BBC for a while, or even though he later became a kind of regular talking head, didn't he? And then after the war, he sort of took his pacifism straight into agitating against nuclear weapons.
Right.
Involved with C&D and civil disobedience around that. I mean, he marched, he spoke, he wrote, a lot in favour of nuclear disarmament. Even went to prison briefly, didn't he, after a protest?
He did.
This, in a sense, is why he is an important countercultural figure in the UK.
It's worth pointing out that the Ban the Bomb movement had a number of phases in which groups would split off to form organizations that were more committed to direct action, towards occupying military bases, to occupying public places, to literally trying to stop the production or the deployment of nuclear weapons. And every time something like that happened, Alex was with the group that wanted to go further. So he was very much a part of sort of radicalizing the movement. But really, I think that an important part of the story for me is that was really a foundation for the counterculture in the UK. An awful lot of people who were very committed to disarmament, and people who just simply wanted to be part of what they saw as sort of a developing community coming out of the Aldermaston marches and so forth, were inspired. Eric Idle from Monty Python was a Aldermaston marcher. Rod Stewart was an Aldermaston marcher. Jenny Diskey was involved. They were inspired directly by the direct action part of movement, which is the part that Alex was really always very committed to.
We've kind of taken him up to the 60s with that, and now we're going to kind of leapfrog right over, back over the joy of sex, because he'd met Jane, or rather started this affair with Jane in the early 60s, which ran through to the early 70s. Then it not becomes an affair because he finally gets divorced just before Joy of Sex comes out, which is, and you can imagine from her point of view, which is that she was very involved with the genesis of that book, and perhaps was tired of being the woman in the shadows. So he marries her. The book is a huge success, and then they move to California. And this is another sort of 1970s countercultural story, isn't it? Because he's a professor at the Neuropsychiatric Institute in University of California. But he gets involved with this community at Sandstone. There's actually an image in More Joy of Sex of goings on at Sandstone, and there's a group of hippie-looking people sitting around with a sort of Allen Ginsberg type playing the acoustic guitar. They're all naked.
Right.
This is, for a kind of Brit who was born in the 20s and, become a public intellectual and amongst all the other things it does. That's quite a radical shift. Here is a sidebar about Sandstone, drawn from Alex Comfort's More Joy of Sex. California abounds in encounter and sensitivity centres. People who go there do or don't find themselves, whatever that means. But a high proportion have the air of going through a lot of psycho make work, and the real object of their exercise is to get laid. At Sandstone, one could, quite frankly, go to get laid. But with that out of the way, participants were surprised to find that sensitivity, encounter, and a good deal of genuine self-education quite often followed. They both enjoyed themselves and did reassess their goals and self-image. Sandstone was many straight people's first and only encounter with genuinely open sexuality in a structured setting. But allowing for this, its capacity to facilitate the sort of growth at which individual psychology aims was pretty remarkable. Sandstone was a large Sierra estate with a ranch-type house and a covered hot pool in the house. The upper large room had a fireplace, sun balcony and ordinary furnishings. The downstairs was an enormous room with a small one adjoining, both with red shag carpets, low lights and mattresses. A small group of people, the family, lived in and maintained the estate, and others who came were effectively John and Barbara Williamson's guests. Intending members might visit once, but they had to join if they wanted to come again. Only couples were admitted. A single visitor had to bring a partner. On several nights a week, there was open house for the 400 or so couples who were members. On some of these occasions, visitors brought their own food, but on Saturdays, an excellent buffet-style dinner was provided, and visitors might stay overnight. Sunbathing and the hot pool were always available. Nudity was general, but neither that nor anything else, except ordinarily civilized behaviour, was obligatory. Open sexual expression of any kind was allowed anywhere except on the front lawn, after a police helicopter nearly crashed while observing it. Drugs and minors were banned, and alcohol not greatly encouraged. The commonest story amongst couples who found Sandstone a good trip, and in Dr. Ralph Yarney's words, the finishing school for psychoanalysis, was this. They would come once, not undress, watch, wonder if they approved, decided they didn't, and leave. About a month later, they would be back and keep coming. On the first few occasions, they would stay strictly together, being stimulated by watching other couples and enjoying the company. Ultimately, the jealousy barrier would yield, often by way of a threesome, and there would be an upsurge of relief and closeness. Others, more aggressive, would start determined to swing, the man bringing the girl by the hair because it would do her good. When, 15 minutes after going downstairs, she was fully turned on to both sexes and he hadn't made it yet with anyone, he would panic and suggest they leave. She would reply, "No way!" And then there would be a row down in the parking lot. This pattern involved a fair amount of high-speed education by the man with regard to the relative sexual appetites and capacities of the sexes. In the ballroom, every occasion was different. Sometimes with too many people, it was like Grand Central Station and any atmosphere of relaxation was lost. At other times, and especially on Wednesdays, when the company was smaller, it could be totally relaxed, charismatic, tender, or zanily playful. On Sunday mornings, early wakers would go up and make coffee, to be followed by a handful of first-timers trying to work out what had hit them and needing to talk about it. Breakfast often ended as an impromptu seminar on something. Sandstone members were united only by being a high IQ group of achievers drawn heavily from the professions. Some of these morning after experiences were even more rewarding than the specifically sexual part of Sandstone, and certainly complementary to it.
It was a complex that's located in Topanga Canyon, north of Los Angeles, right on the coast, and looking out over the ocean. Sandstone was a sort of a free love intentional community that existed for really only about 3 years. And actually, and Alex had been introduced to it earlier on, a couple of years before he wrote Joy of Sex. He knew the place well. He'd been there quite often. He went there with Jane a couple of times after they moved out. By the time Joy of Sex was published, Sandstone had closed. But Alex was still very enthusiastic about the model. He even, before he moved to California, he actually had talked to the people there about maybe trying to start a chapter of it in the UK. That didn't come across. So Alex moves to California. He produces more Joy of Sex in fairly short order after Joy of Sex. It's actually the more radical of the two because he wanted to talk about how the pill and the sexual revolution could change not only lifestyles, but literally the way society is structured, that you could have family groups that are not just biological family, but intentional families that could involve multiple couples bringing up children in a cooperative way. And he was talking about this and talking about Sandstone in More Joy of Sex. His American publisher actually got cold feet over that, and they tried to get him to take the section about Sandstone out because they thought that was going too far for American audiences. He got them to leave it in. He could be very stubborn when it came to having his way about this kind of thing. And the book was again a bestseller.
With the background of both in the US and the UK, this move after the 60s, a lot of people involved in the counterculture moved out into the country, into communes. They setting up what we'd call intentional communities, right? And these ideas of like breaking down the traditional family unit, of a couple, male and female at that time, with children, but having it as multiple parents and kids all together. These experiments were going on, weren't they? And Sandstone,
yes,
which I think was more free love within couples, as it were, swinging, as we would say, I suppose, shortcut for it.
They didn't like being called swingers, though.
Okay.
But Sandstone was really about creating a community, a sort of a core family group that would be a multiple adults who could have more or less permanent relationships with each other, but weren't exclusive. Swingers who came to Sandstone often found the place a little too buttoned up because they simply wanted to have a lot of sex with a lot of people. Whereas the idea of Sandstone was more to create a community out of it,
right.
To sort of experiment with lifestyles, with ways of living. In the eyes of the public, there wasn't much difference. When Alex wrote Joy of Sex and talked about this, that's when the right really came down on him, and the reviews that the book were much more indignant.
Because it's much more threatening to traditional social structures.
Right.
He didn't like being called or known as Dr. Sex, obviously because he'd done so much of the work. We've not really had time to talk about his work in gerontology, right? Which he'd been doing right back in the 50s. Back in 69, he was suggesting that life expectancy could be extended to 120 years within the next 20 years, and didn't quite get that right. But actually, again, quite ahead of his time, because there's a lot of people working on that now.
Certainly made headlines when he said it back then. And later on, he actually was a little bit somewhat distressed about it because as a gerontologist, his big focus was really more on quality of life. He did write about sex for the aged. That's actually a big trying to get people to have a more affirmative attitude towards sex among the very elderly. And he wrote about this and campaigned for it, making 70 the new 60 or 60 the new 50 or 80 the new 70, rather than sort of extending life ad infinitum. He was very concerned about how to figure out how to allow older people to have better, more vigorous lives.
But sadly, that didn't work out for him and Jane, because he carries on producing book after book and all these other activities, but she becomes quite unhappy. She gets quite depressed. Probably she's been plucked out of her own context and is out in California. We don't know how she felt, or maybe about the things that were going on at Sandstone, and she starts drinking, etc. She becomes quite depressed. So they move back to the UK. Mm-hmm. And really from then on, their own life, aging people isn't so happy. In the early 90s, he has a series of strokes and she dies. And he lived until about the year 2000?
2000.
2000, yeah. We didn't mention, and we should do, is that Alex had a son, Nick, who's still alive.
Right.
And, what happened with Ruth, particularly after the divorce and after the publication of Joy of Sex, and how was life for her?
Well, Ruth had, you got to bear in mind that this sort of open relationship that the three of them had lasted for about a dozen years until finally Alex got the divorce and married Jane. And Ruth was already making a kind of her own life for herself by that time. She was a social worker, and she went back to work as a social worker in the early 60s and had a career doing that until she retired. She never remarried. And actually, she and Alex, especially after the divorce, they continued to be friendly. So she had her career, she retired. Yeah, she actually died almost exactly the same time Alex did. She didn't share the kind of life that he wanted to have, and she never wanted to have anything to do with Joy of Sex.
The Joy of Sex was still on a 5 bestsellers list when he died. Whether he wanted to be known as Dr. Sex or not, he couldn't really get away with it. And I suppose it is naive to believe that, sexual liberation will, bring about massive social changes for the good. The times are so different now, and say with online pornography, with a completely different way of showing sex, not between loving couples usually, all across the sexual landscape, wide open, but in a very, very different way than the Joy of Sex, isn't it? I mean, I don't know if you can speculate on what you think Alex Comfort would have thought about where we are now in this regard.
To put it in context, the Joy of Sex, in a way, was kind of the last link in a chain that goes back to Marie Stopes and her books, where part of the thrust was simply to get information out, accurate information about sex that could overcome old wives' tales that were handed down and the misinformation that people tended to get. That was something that has to some extent been accomplished. I think what Alex would be appalled by in the States is the miserable state that sex education has come to, where a lot of it is literally abstinence education, the kind of thing that doesn't work and simply leaves people, their teenage years, in a state of ignorance when they most need to know what is what. I think the other thing is that the violence in sex has not been eliminated. The Me Too movement brought this to the fore, was the amount of sexual violence, the amount of feeling of propriety that powerful men have often towards women, even men who don't have a lot of power feel towards women. Alex would be going back to this analysis of his about the need for sociality as part of what sex is supposed to do in society, and he'd feel like we haven't gotten anywhere with that. That was the most important thing to him. We still seem to be very far from achieving the kind of society we want in that respect. So I think he'd have some very harsh things to say.
But he did, to a large extent, put a lot of joy into sex. He changed a lot of people's lives for the better with these books. But obviously what you've done is excavate and explore that in his life there was a lot more to him than the man who wrote or edited, as he claimed at first, The Joy of Sex. I hope that we sort of seated him properly as a countercultural figure, not in an obvious way, along with the Allen Ginsbergs and the sort of notables of the 60s, but in his own way, actually sort of preceded them and actually took those ideas into the mainstream, which is really important, isn't it, to refresh it and to, provide it with new ideas. So, Eric, thanks for writing the book, and thanks for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
A pleasure. I'm very glad to be included. I'm very glad for Alex to be included in the Bureau.
Thanks very much to Eric. Fascinating stuff. I've got a copy of both The Joy of Sex and More Joy of Sex right here in front of me. Recent acquisitions, I must hasten to add. They are quite attractive books. It's a bit odd getting a second-hand copy, obviously. And of course, they're a bit tame, I suppose, in these days, in our world of widescreen, anything goes, gonzo internet porn. There wasn't a copy of either in my childhood home, unfortunately. I grew up in a very Catholic house. There was a book called Sex and Your Children, a very unfortunate title, a kind of Catholic primer. As you can imagine, it wasn't that informative, and it certainly wasn't very sexy. It was biological, I seem to remember, and I think written by a priest. It did have a sort of slightly mystical angle to it. I recall, was it in chapter 3? Some reference to the wedding night when, you know, in the heat of the man's love for the Holy Spirit and his wife, his penis would enter his wife's vagina. I had this sort of vision of it sort of detaching itself and making its way, hopping its way across the bed. I may have mentioned this before, so forgive me, it is a bit too much information. Might re-triggered some trauma there for me. Anyway, I hope that you found some joy in this episode and your appetite has been whetted and you'll be back for more. We've had a few episodes around the themes of drugs lately. Now we've returned to sex, so I think maybe next time we'll go back to rock and roll. Why not? Do keep in touch, bureauoflostculture.com, and I will see you next time, further down the road, round the bend and over the hillsides for more tales from the underground. Let's finish with some music.